All right, welcome students to another week of Chemistry of Everyday Life. This week, we're gonna go inside the body. Last week, we talked about water, right, and environment, so that's outside the body, the chemistry outside us. Now we're gonna focus inward. We're gonna take a look at the chemistry of food and what is giving us life. So to start out with that, let's take a look at the basic fundamental unit of life, which is known as the cell. And again, this is not a biochemistry class or even a biology class, so it won't really make you know all this in detail, other than to show you this image, to show you the general feel for the cell. So the cell has many individual components. For example, here you have the mitochondria. This is the powerhouse of the cell. This is where energy is produced. And you have other structures here, but the structure that I want to focus in on right now is the nucleus. So the nucleus is where you store a very special molecule known as DNA. So let's take a look further at DNA. So DNA has three components. The first component is the deoxyribose part. This is the sugar component, and sugar is a molecule that we'll take a look at in a bit, but for now, let's just know that this is a sugar component. The second component is called a base component. It has a molecule moiety that has a nitrogen in it. And there are different types of bases that composes the DNA. They are all made, or they are similar to two molecules. The first one here is pyrimidine. This is just a aromatic nitrogen-containing molecule. Now, from this pyrimidine, you have these three other bases that are similar to it, known primarily as uracil, thiamine, and cytosine. The other are related to a molecule known as purine. It is also aromatic, but now two rings. Okay, so we get from that adenine and guanine. And then the last component you get is the phosphate. So with these three groups together, we get what is known as nucleotides. Okay, so these are the kind of the building blocks of the DNA. So for example here, this is the phosphate group, this is the sugar group, and then that's the base group. And together, you would get a cytosine as your nucleotide, and so on and so forth of all of these structures here, right? So you get the CTGA, as you know in DNA, the code for your life. Let's further take a look at the DNA structure. Now, if you connect them together in a chain like that, you get your DNA sequence. For example, this is G, T, A, C. And from a kind of a 3D structure wise, the bases have something known as base pairing. So they have hydrogen bonding that occurs that makes them kind of twist to become a helix. Now, so what is the purpose of DNA? I kind of alluded to earlier. The DNA is basically our blueprint. It is the instruction manual to make everything in your body, to making enzymes, making hormones, right? All of these are made in your body. And it is following this blueprint, this instruction manual known as the DNA. Now, in order to make things that provide us life, we not only need components for it, but we also need the energy source for that. So how we're going to get that? Now, plants get their energy from the sun. Other things, other animals like humans cannot do that. So we need to consume it. So that's why we're going to lead into the discussion about food. And really the food, why we need to eat, the food that we need to eat are the molecules that we get from it. So we'll talk about the three types of molecules that we get from our food. The first type is known as carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates can be broken down to three subgroups, you could call it. The first group we're not going to talk about much is called the sugar alcohols. They include things like sorbitol and mannitol. The two other groups that we'll talk about, the first group is known as the simple carbohydrates. The last group is known as the complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates include things like glucose, fructose, galactose, and sucrose, right? So all of these we usually think of when we think of sugars, okay? Whereas the complex carbohydrate, we think about them as starches and cellulose. So we'll take a dive into these two types of carbohydrates. First, the sugars, then the complex sugars. So first, let's start with the simple sugar. The most simple sugar is the monosaccharide. So what defines a sugar? As long as it has some this feature of having multiple OHs. The fancy word for that is polyhydroxyl. And then they are connected at the end with an aldehyde group or a ketone group. So recall back to our organic chemistry unit to know what these groups are. Okay, so as long as you have these hydroxyl groups and a carbonyl group at the end there. Okay, so for our first example here is glucose. We see here that we have an aldehyde group and a bunch of hydroxyl groups coming down. Okay, so glucose is a very important sugar, and we'll talk about glucose many times in this lecture. Next here we have galactose, also an aldehyde sugar. And again, it has all these OH groups. Galactose is the sugar in your milk. Now, take a look at these two structures. They're very similar, right? What is the difference between them? They're identical almost, right? From the top here, you go down, they're identical to each other, except at this carbon here. It's just the orientation of the OH group is on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side of the other molecule. But that makes them different molecules. And then our last example here is fructose. Okay, so fructose, unlike the other two, is actually a ketone sugar. So it has two carbons instead of hydrogen on that carbonyl group. Fructose is found primarily in fruits. That's why it's called fructose, from the Latin word for fruit, and in things like honey. Now, these sugars, these monosaccharides, really exist primarily in a cyclic form. So the oxygens kind of come back and to form a ring onto itself. So you might see them written more like the circles that we see here. So little facts about these monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are absorbed directly into your bloodstream when they enter your digestive system when you eat, right? So they provide quick energy, a quick energy source for your body. And because of that, glucose is often called blood sugar. Now, let's put that aside. That's a monosaccharide. What do you think this one is? Disaccharides. They are 2 units of the same sugar that we saw earlier. Okay, so one example of that is sucrose. Do you know where sucrose is encountered in everyday life? Sucrose is your table sugar, right? So this is what you are consuming when you are using sugar in our everyday language there. And where do they come from? They come from sugarcane and beets and stuff like that. And as you see here, they are a disaccharide. Why? Because they are composed of glucose and fructose. Okay, if you combine them at that oxygen there, they are now 2 molecules conjoined together into 1 molecule known as sucrose. And so sucrose can also go in the opposite direction. When we break things apart using water, we call that hydrolysis. We say it is hydrolyzed. So when we eat sugar, our body can take that sugar, hydrolyze it to become glucose and fructose. And that monosaccharide is then the energy source. Remember we said glucose was the currency of cell metabolism. So that's why eating sugar gives us glucose, and glucose gives us energy in our body, in our cells. Okay, another important or popular or well-known disaccharide is lactose. And where have we heard that word lactose? Lactose intolerant, right? Okay, so let's talk about lactose a bit. Lactose, like sucrose, can also be hydrolyzed, broken apart by water with an enzyme's help, of course, to become glucose and galactose. Again, those 2 things can be used for energy. Now, that enzyme that I talked about in this process is known as lactase, right? So when humans are babies, we have this enzyme in us, this lactase enzyme. So when we take milk from a mother as babies, that lactose is converted into glucose and galactose, and therefore it is the food that feeds us. When we become adults, human, not all of us, but most of us lose this enzyme, this lactase enzyme. So when we take lactose, we can't process it. When we can't process it, it gives us stomach cramps, stomach aches, and other side effects. If you are lactose intolerant, you would know. So when we take lactate, for example, for lactose intolerant people, when we take lactate, which is a milk that has been treated with lactase itself, so you actually just drinking glucose and galactose at that point. Now, lactose intolerant people can also consume milk products, for example, cheese or yogurt, because during the fermentation process, the lactose has been broken down by the bacteria in order to make that product at the end. That's why lactose intolerant people can oftentimes eat cheese and yogurt. Okay, now let's move on to the last category of the carbohydrates. This is known as the polysaccharides. Okay, the root word here is poly, meaning many. So if you have many units of the monosaccharides, you get what is known as a polysaccharide. Some examples include the starch, the cellulose, and the glycogen. I'll talk more about the starch and the cellulose in a bit, and I won't talk about much about glycogen other than at this slide here. Glycogen is basically a bunch of glucose molecules chained up all together in different branches. Now, glycogen is when you eat the glucose and when you don't use it right away, your body stores that glucose in chains of it, known as glycogen, in your muscle. So sometimes when you are hungry, this is the first source of energy. It takes the glycogen and breaks it down back into from your muscle back into glucose molecules to use as energy. Okay, so that's glycogen. It's a bunch of units of glucose. Now, starch and cellulose are very similar. They are just also units of glucose, but they're just kind of connected in different ways that we won't get into, but just know that they are connected differently. And that difference in connection actually makes a whole world of difference in terms of they being food or not. Okay, so let's first start with starch. So starch is, of the two, is the digestible one. It's the one that actually we can eat and turn into energy. So they are food of the two polysaccharides. Again, they are polymers of glucose, just like glycogen. And where do we see them the most? Starch. We see them the most in things like grains. So or flour, when we eat bread, pasta, or rice. Now, we just said that all of these foods are polymers of glucose, right? And glucose is the sugar, it's sweet, right? But when you eat bread, it's not sweet. Or just white rice is not sweet, right? But so here's an experiment you can do today, right? So maybe if you're eating rice, something just very plain rice, like a plain bread, unsalted, unflavored, so no sugar, just chew on it. Just chew on it for a long time. Chew on it a while. And hopefully in the beginning, you don't notice anything, but hopefully at the end, near the end of that, you might notice a sweet sensation in your mouth. Why is that? Remember, we just said starch are multiple chains of glucose, which is sweet. So what happens when you're mechanically chewing, you're breaking down first the food, but also in your mouth are enzymes that are breaking down the starch into its glucose component. And as you are releasing the glucose component, your tongue can register that as being sweet. So go ahead and try this tonight and see if you get that sensation. It's pretty cool to feel like, oh, this rice, this bread is actually sweet. So if you like sweet, maybe one way to not eat too much sugar is to eat things more slowly, to chew your bread and rice more. All right, so we said that they are the primary source of our energy. So how much energy? They give us 4 calories per gram. But what happens to the energy that is not used right away? We store them, as I said in the previous slide, in your muscle tissue as glycogen. And glycogen is a limited amount. You can't store everything as glycogen. What happens when we eat too much, way too much, and we have a lot of excess of sugar, a lot of excess of carbs? They then are stored in your body as fat. Now let's focus on the second carbohydrate complex sugar here, cellulose. Now, cellulose has no calories, at least for humans. So we as humans do not have the enzyme to turn the cellulose into glucose. Other animals do. like termites, like cows, they can turn cellulose into glucose. So that's why they can eat things like grass, things like wood to give them as a fuel source. Humans, we do not have the enzymes. But however, even though they do not give us calories, cellulose are important in your diet because they are known as dietary fibers. They are the one that makes your bowel movement, your digestive system go. So they are very healthy for us nonetheless. So where are they? Like I said, they are in things like leaves, so grass. They are in the bark, the wood, the trunk of a tree. They are like cotton, right? So they're things you think of that humans cannot eat, but they are still carbohydrates. All right. So let's move on to our second type of molecules known as lipids. Okay, lipids gives us a whopping amount of energy, 9 calories per gram, almost, well, actually more than double that of the carbohydrates. So lipids can be categorized further. What they all share in common, though, unlike carbohydrates, carbohydrates are determined by the fact of functional groups. Lipids are not. Lipids are more determined by the fact that they are molecules in your body that are not water soluble, mainly because they have a lot of carbon, hydrogen, so non-polar components. Okay, let's break down lipids into its multiple categories. Lipids can be broken down to two primary categories of fatty acids and steroids. We'll put steroids aside for now and come back to it in a bit. Let's first talk about fatty acids. And in the fatty acids, they can be broken down further, but we're only focusing on triglycerides. So what are fatty acids? From a chemical perspective, fatty acids are just long chains of carbon, so carbon and hydrogen chains, so very non-polar with a carboxylic end, carboxylic acid end. Now, when you take the fatty acids, 3 of them, and you combine it with 1 unit of glycerol, you get what you know as triglycerides. The tri coming from the 3 fatty acids, the glyceride coming from the glycerol molecule. Okay, so this oxygen basically replaces this carboxylic acid chain here to connect them, and they do it 3 times. So each alcohol groups, each hydroxyl groups is connecting the fatty acids. Okay, so what are triglycerides? Triglycerides are exactly what you think about when you think of fat. When you think about fat in your food, the oils that you eat, like the avocado oil, the olive oil, the fat in the meats, animal fat, they're all triglycerides. And based on this structural formula here, what functional group do you see? This carbonyl group with an oxygen, that makes it an ester, right? So triglycerides are basically esters of fatty acids and glycerol, as I mentioned earlier. So how does our body use triglycerides, right? So triglycerides are stored around our organs and under our skin as a energy reserve, okay? So, and on top of that, when they surround our organs, they also kind of give us a cushion and protects our organs. So when we need, they are reserved because when we need the energy, we hydrolyze. Remember that word? Is to cut with water and an enzyme. In this case, it's called a lipase. We cut it back to fatty acids and glycerol. So that forward reaction, we're going backwards. We're going backwards to the fatty acids and the glycerol. And why is that? Because the glycerol, for one, can be burned directly to use as energy, but also it can be converted to glucose. And as we've seen before, glucose is used as an energy currency, energy source, right? So that's how we use triglycerides, fats, when we eat. Now, in a previous lecture, we talked about the 3 types of fats. So the 3 types of triglycerides. Remember, there were the saturated fats, the unsaturated fats, which has 2 categories of trans and cis unsaturated fats. Remember which one is good and which one is bad? Naturally, in nature, there's the saturated fats, so all single bond. That's the bad one. And naturally, we also have cis unsaturated fats. That's a double bond, but with a cis phase. That's actually the good fat, the good kind. The unnatural type of fat called the trans fat is also unsaturated. That's also the bad one. So bads are unsaturated, trans, and saturated fats, right? That's the one the doctors tell us to kind of avoid in our diet. Now, let's take a look at that in further detail here. So what then is hydrogenated oil, right? So the margarine that you spread in on your butter is actually made from good fat. It's actually made from olive oil maybe, or vegetable oil. Remember, all of those natural unsaturated oil, unsaturated fat has a double bond that is cis. The reason why the cis is so good for us because it has a kink in it because it has that little a bend shape. That bend shape makes it hard to stack all the fats together. Unlike saturated fat, which is all single carbon bonds, they are like logs. They can stack upon each other and make them very dense. And for a reason we won't go into, that's not good for our biochemistry. Now, when we take the good fat and we hydrogenate it, it becomes the bad fat. And why do we do that? We do that because people like the taste. Instead of pouring like oil, vegetable oil, olive oil on your bread, people like having it as a solid board to spread on the bread. Okay, in like kind of umbrella term, we kind of group them together. The saturated fat and the trans fat, we group them together, and they do the same thing because they cause similar diseases in us. Okay, so how are they related? So the reason why they're bad, I'm really simplifying this because this is not a medical class. They are bad for us because they deposit these fats on our artery walls, on the walls of our artery, and then over time our artery walls will harden, and which is bad. When there's a blood clot, the blood clot, because the artery walls are getting smaller and smaller and harder, blood clots can then be lodged into that artery, and therefore blood is no longer flowing, and that's bad. And we can break that down to why, two reasons why they are bad. If that happens in a muscle of your heart, we call that the heart attack. Now, if that happens in an artery that supplies blood to your brain, we call that a stroke. So both of those are bad things that can happen and can lead to death, right? Another lipid that can also be bad for us, unlike aside from the triglycerides, is our next one, the cholesterol. So if you go back to that first slide where I divided up the different fats, one is the fatty acids and one is the steroid. So cholesterol is the other one. Unlike the fatty acids that's used for energy, cholesterol is not really used for energy. This is the molecule of cholesterol. It's used for other cellular processes. It's, for example, used as a precursor to make hormones in our body, right? Again, why they're called lipids is because it's not very soluble in water because of all those carbon-carbon bonds, non-polar features of that molecule. Now, because they are not very polar, they are not very soluble in water, and blood is basically all water, so they can't be transported very well in our blood system. And blood is basically the rivers that in our riverways that brings everything from one place to another in our body. So things need to be able to travel in our blood, right? But since cholesterol cannot be soluble in water, it needs like almost like a chaperone, somebody to kind of take it around in our blood system. And so we call that the lipoproteins. What that is when a bunch of proteins kind of come together and kind of surround and protect your lipid, protect your cholesterol in order to make it soluble in the blood and therefore transport it throughout your body. Now, lipoproteins, where have you heard of that? LDL, you've heard of this, right? Yes, from the doctors maybe. So LDL stands for low density lipoproteins. These are the lipoproteins that carry the cholesterol into your different body parts for whatever use they have. However, because when they are carried like that, they have a chance of being deposited in your arteries and then clogging them just like the triglycerides can. That's why they are not great. The other kind is the HDL, high density lipoproteins. These are great for us because they just carry cholesterol to a liver to be excreted out to get rid of them. So they are considered the good protein, where LDL is considered the bad protein. I mean, HDL is considered the good cholesterol. LDL is considered the bad cholesterol. All right, I said proteins because I am thinking ahead, And that's the last molecule that we'll talk about today are the proteins. Proteins are basically things that make up things in our body like the muscle, the hair, the enzymes. Enzymes are basically kind of molecular machineries that make your cells function. Besides that, though, they are also a source of food for us because they give us 4 calories per gram, much like carbohydrates. Proteins are polymers. Remember that word? Polymers are just molecules that are made up of repeating units. They are polymers of what is known as amino acid. So amino acid basically has an amine group and a carboxylic acid group. If you have that, you call it an amino acid. Now, what differentiates between each amino acid is this R group. R could be anything that branches out. When the nitrogen side, the amine side, connects to the carboxylic side of an amino acid, we get what is known as a peptide, and that is known as a peptide bond. And if you link them all more and more and more, you get essentially a protein. So let's go back to the building block before we talk more into the protein here. There are 21 essential amino acids. I'm showing you them here. You don't have to remember them. You don't have to know them really, just to know that they exist like this. And the difference is that R group, you see how the chain goes down, and that's what differentiates them. Okay, so plants can make some amino acids, not all. And then like animals that eat the plants, like cows and stuff, can eat the plants in order to get the amino acids and then to make some more animal amino acids. Humans cannot make our amino acids, so we either we eat the plants and the animals in order to make to give us amino acids. And remember, we need the amino acids because they are the building block of proteins in our body, and proteins are what makes our cells function. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so if you're an omnivore, you eat both plants and animal, you would get all of your essential amino acids, all 21 of them. If you are a vegetarian, for example, you might not get all of your essential amino acids unless you are very like specific about and intentional about what you eat. For example, let's list some plant-based foods that has all 21 amino acids. We call that a complete protein. The greatest one of them all is quinoa. It has all of your 21 amino acids. And if you can't eat that, second best would be things like soy, chia seed, tempeh, and amaranth. You guys know what amaranth is? Amaranth actually it's like spinach. It's a leafy, kind of green, but sometimes red vegetable. But I was surprised to find that that has a lot of protein also. So going back to having those essential amino acids, if you connect them all together, like I said, from the amine side with the carboxylic acid side, we would make a peptide, and we call that a peptide bond. If you have a long chains of peptide, we basically have what is known as a protein. And a protein can fold in various ways due to hydrogen bonding. If they fold in a circular helix shape, we call that alpha, the alpha structure. Or if it folds in more like a sheet, we call that the beta structure or beta sheets. Now, in a molecule of protein, we can have both of these structures in, and depending on the 3D shape of that molecule, of that protein, it will have different function. Again, that's a huge kind of a topic we won't get into in this class. But I'll show you some examples. So the first example here are the protein of actin and myosin. And these two proteins is what is responsible for movement, the pulling of muscles, basically, flexing and pulling of muscles. All right. So when you are eating meat, when we're eating protein, this is what we're really eating. We're eating the protein of actin and myosin, right? So this is what we really think about when we're eating meat, because this is what is meat? Meat is basically muscle tissue, right? And muscle tissue is made up of actin and myosin primarily. Now, let's take a look at proteins that aren't really food, you don't really think about as being food, but they are also proteins. Just for kind of completeness here. The first one is insulin. This is the protein that regulates the glucose, the blood sugar in our body. So it looks like that. And hemoglobin, which is quite different because it's actually multiple proteins coming together to form this gigantic structure. And what does hemoglobin do? It basically takes oxygen throughout your body. So I think that ends our lecture today. So just to summarize, we talked about the chemistry of our food and why we eat them. So we break them into 3 categories of carbohydrates, of lipids, and of proteins. Some of them just give us energy, but some of the other ones give us the building blocks that make life possible. And then lastly, firstly, we talked about the DNA molecule. So there's actually 4 types of different molecules that is important for this week. All right. So see you next time.